On a bitter winter night, a humble peasant girl finds a stranger shivering beneath a bridge and selflessly offers him her only blanket, unaware he's the prince in disguise. Her simple act of kindness ignites a powerful connection neither expected, pulling her into a world of secrets, jealousy, and forbidden longing. Amidst whispers and royal intrigue, their quiet bond grows into a love so deep it threatens to unravel the very foundations of a kingdom. But can a single moment of warmth in the cold overcome a lifetime of duty and tradition? Before we begin this beautiful period romance story, tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I love knowing where you're joining me from. The snowstorm had begun at dusk, but by nightfall it had turned fierce, sweeping down from the black forest in whirls of white, its breath sharp enough to steel. The thatched roofs of Badenweiler lay buried beneath a shifting blanket of white, the chimneys exhaling long tendrils of smoke into the wind as if in defiance of winter's siege. Trees stood like bare sentinels against the sky, their limbs creaking as the gale pushed through them. In the darkness, the roads were nearly invisible, smoothed over with drifts, the fences swallowed whole. Anneliese Mertens pulled her cloak tighter, though the wool had long since given up any warmth. Her boots squelched with each step, packed with half-melted snow, and her feet had gone from stinging to numb. The lantern in her hand cast a narrow circle of amber, barely reaching the edge of the footpath as she trudged uphill, away from the village, and toward the edge of the forest. She kept her head down, eyes sharp for signs of tracks or anything caught in the iron traps she'd set that morning near the bridge. Her breath came in visible puffs. Her fingers, despite the mittens she wore, felt stiff and useless. She should not have gone out. Her grandmother would have said so, had she been awake enough to protest. But the old woman's cough had worsened, dry and deep, and the root vegetables they'd boiled for supper had barely filled the broth pot. Her sister Lotta, only 10 and too thin for the season, had eaten slowly, blinking sleep from her eyes as she lay curled beneath the quilts. It had been enough to make Anneliese gather her basket, light her lantern, and venture out into the kind of cold that made even wolves retreat into dens. The old Roman bridge lay east of the village, arching low over the narrow river that twisted through the valley like a thread of black silk. In warmer months, the moss between its stones glowed green, and children dared each other to leap across the river from its ledges. Tonight, it looked like something forgotten by time, the stones slick with ice, the surrounding trees brittle and silver with frost. Snow curled along the edges of the bridge like resting fog. She crouched near her first trap, set between two rocks where rabbits often passed. Nothing. She moved to the next, flicking her lantern upward to break the darkness. Her breath hitched in her chest when she saw it. At first, she thought it might be a fallen sack of grain, or perhaps a deer struck down by cold. But as her light adjusted, she saw the shape of a man curled at the river's edge, half under the bridge's shelter. His cloak was soaked through, blending into the earth, and the snow had begun to drift over him, clinging to his shoulders and the side of his face. One hand lay motionless near a tree root, fingers bare and scraped. His boots were leather, high, polished once, though now caked with slush, and far too fine for a woodsman. She stepped cautiously, unsure if he were dead or only sleeping, and held the lantern closer. The flame wavered with the wind, throwing shadows across the sharp line of his cheekbone, the dark smear near his temple. Blood. A cut, not deep but fresh. It had frozen into the skin already. Still, she hesitated. The last time someone had found a stranger on the outskirts of the forest, it had been a thief, half mad from hunger, dangerous in the way of cornered animals. But this man didn't move, didn't stir at her approach. Only when she stood close enough to hear his breathing did he flinch, a faint, ragged exhale escaping as his head turned toward her voice. "You'll freeze," she said. But the words came out too low, swallowed by the wind. He didn't answer at first. His eyes were half-lidded, unfocused, but not vacant. When she knelt beside him, placing the lantern on the ground, he blinked slowly and tried to sit upright, only to falter again. His jaw clenched as he found her eyes. "Don't," he said. The voice was hoarse, but unmistakably refined, the kind of German not taught in cottages. "I'm no one." Annalisa paused. "You're not no one," she murmured. "You're freezing to death." "I'll be fine," he muttered. But the shiver that racked his body betrayed the lie. She saw it, how his hands, though muddied, bore no calluses, how his posture, even slumped against the ground, carried a quiet authority. He was no farmer, no peddler or tradesman, and still, there he lay, in the dirt, soaked, with blood on his temple and a storm raging overhead. Without another word, she shrugged out of her blanket, her only one, and draped it over his shoulders. He made a sound of protest, low and surprised. "Don't be foolish," she said, more sharply than she meant to. "You'll lose your fingers before morning, or worse." He looked at her then, truly looked, his eyes clearer now, though rimmed with exhaustion. Green, a dark, storm shadow green. Something flickered in them, not recognition, but calculation, as though he were trying to place her, to understand why she was here at all. She didn't wait for him to argue. With the numbness in her hands spreading, she began gathering twigs from the roots of the bridge, small dry branches from under the eaves where the snow hadn't reached. Her flint was in her basket. The wind made it difficult, but eventually, a thin flame licked to life and spread into a fragile fire, enough to glow orange against the stone. She fed it slowly, shielding the embers with her body, and felt the heat reach her hands just enough to sting. The man drew closer to the fire, his body shivering uncontrollably. She saw him wince as he adjusted his arm, likely bruised or worse. He said nothing more, and she didn't press. The silence between them was strange, not uncomfortable, but weighted, as if something had been suspended there, caught in the cold. Minutes passed. The wind howled beyond the arch, and the snow danced like ash in the firelight. Beneath the bridge, it was warmer. Not warm, but survivable. His breathing had steadied. She watched him from across the flames. His eyes had closed again, but not in sleep. He was listening. She could tell. His chest rose evenly, his shoulders no longer hunched in pain. Whoever he was recovering. For now. Her own body began to ache. Without the blanket, the chill pressed in, unforgiving. She wrapped her arms around herself and told herself it was only a night. That come morning, he would be gone, and the bridge would be empty again. That the strange intensity in his gaze meant nothing. She waited until the fire had shrunk to embers and his shivering had ceased before gathering her basket. He didn't stir as she stood. She said nothing. There was nothing to say. Only a stranger with a wound. A silence she couldn't explain, and the memory of something unusual in the way he'd looked at her. As if he wasn't used to being helped. As if he didn't know what to make of it. She returned home through the snow with her cloak clutched tight, the wind tearing at her braid and the cold gnawing at her bones. By the time she reached the door, her teeth were chattering. The fire in the hearth had died to a dull glow. Her grandmother stirred in bed but didn't wake. Lotta lay beneath the quilts, curled into herself. Annalisa moved through the cottage in silence, removing her boots, her gloves, kneeling at the hearth to breathe the fire back to life. The warmth reached her face slowly, her fingers tingled. She ladled out the last of the broth, thin and pale, and stared into the steam. She didn't know who he was. Didn't care. She'd helped a man in need, nothing more. But even as she told herself this, the image of his face refused to leave her. The angle of his jaw, the firelight reflecting off his eyes, the controlled way he'd spoken despite the cold. She was still staring at the bowl when she heard it. The sound of boots on the road. Then hooves. Several horses, heavy and slow, not village horses but trained ones, their gait even, their weight measured. Then voices muffled through the snow, clipped and formal. And then the unmistakable knock of a soldier's gloved hand on her cottage door. The knock had been deliberate, sharp, with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Not a neighbor, not the village pastor, and certainly not one of the mill workers sent by the baker in winter to barter for herbs or thread. It came again, firmer this time, followed by the sound of leather shifting and the low exhale of a horse's breath. Annalisa reached for the latch with a hand she tried to keep steady, though her heart had begun to beat with a quick, shallow rhythm that pressed against her ribs. Snow blew in with the door, sharp and bright against the dim warmth of the cottage. She blinked against the cold and stared upward, first at a pair of black boots, then at crimson wool overlaid with gold braid. The two soldiers stood still as statues, their coats marked with the sigil of House Falkenberg, a silver stag beneath a stylized crown, embroidered into the fabric at the chest. The breath caught in her throat. Their kind did not venture this far into the woods without reason. This village, with its worn cobbles and low roofs, was rarely worth a nobleman's passing glance, much less the attention of the court's own guard. But the soldiers weren't looking at her with suspicion. Their gazes were steady, measuring, as if confirming something they already knew. Between them, a black horse shifted its weight. The rider held the reins loosely, his gloved hand resting on the pommel, his shoulders straight beneath a velvet-lined traveling coat. The horse snorted, stamping once on the snow. The man dismounted slowly, his boots pressing cleanly into the earth, and for a moment, Annalisa saw the truth of him in full. It was the man from the bridge. But not as he had been, no longer soaked and broken and shivering beneath the wind. He stood tall now, unbowed, though a faint discoloration still marred the edge of his jaw. His clothing was a deep navy, lined with silver thread, the buttons polished to a shine. His hair, now brushed back from his brow, revealed a clean cut just beneath the hairline. He looked not like a wanderer, but like a man born into control. His gaze found hers at once, and held it. Her fingers tightened around the doorframe, her throat dry. The soldiers stepped aside, and he approached, slowly, deliberately, each step confident, but without arrogance. When he stopped just before her, the air between them felt suspended, as if the winter wind had paused to listen. He didn't speak to the soldiers. He didn't announce his title, nor did he bow with the exaggerated courtesy nobles used when greeting commoners. He simply reached into his coat and drew out a small bundle wrapped in fresh linen, square and careful. "I believe this belongs to you," he said. His voice was different now, deeper, still calm, but stripped of the roughness from the night before. There was clarity in it, a cool authority that only reinforced what she already suspected. Still, he looked at her with something she could not name. Not gratitude exactly, and not command. Something quieter, something personal. She took the bundle with both hands. The wool was unmistakable, hers. Clean, warm from being pressed against his side. Her only blanket, laundered and returned to her as if it were something of worth. Her lips parted, but no words came. "I came to return what you gave," he said, "and to thank you. You helped me when I had nothing." He said it plainly, without performance, but the words struck harder than she expected. The snow fell between them in soft gusts, the sound of the wind filling the space where silence grew thick. Then, more softly, he asked, "May I come in?" Annalisa didn't move at first. The question settled over her like a weight. A man like him, whoever he was, did not belong inside a cottage like hers. He did not ask things of women like her, nor did he cross thresholds without ceremony or purpose. Her instincts screamed caution. Yet behind him, the soldiers made no move to interrupt, no suggestion that he was speaking out of turn. She glanced over her shoulder. The hearth glowed faintly with a new fire. Her grandmother stirred in the bed, mumbling softly beneath the quilts. Lotta had risen from behind the curtain, her wide eyes peeking out, mouth parted in silent awe. Still, Annalisa hesitated, not out of fear, but because something in her heart had begun to shift in quiet rebellion. She stepped aside. He passed through the doorway like a shadow, slow and deliberate, ducking slightly beneath the beam. The interior of the cottage was dim compared to the white expanse outside, and he paused for a moment as if adjusting to the space. His eyes scanned everything: the uneven stone floor, the hearth ringed with blackened iron, the single table with its patched cloth, the two sleeping pallets in the corner. Frost clung to the inside of the window pane. The air smelled of ash and thyme. He said nothing, but there was a stillness in him, an alertness, as if he were cataloguing every detail, not to judge, but to understand. She watched him from the doorway, her arms wrapped around herself, the blanket still in her hands. He looked strangely out of place, not merely because of his clothes, but because of the way he carried silence like a second coat. There was no urgency in him, no haste. Only that same unnerving calm, as if he were meant to be standing there, as if this visit had always been inevitable. Her grandmother shifted again, coughing lightly in her sleep. Lotte, barefoot and cautious, crept forward until she stood beside Anneliese and whispered, "Is he a king?" Anneliese gave a tiny shake of her head, unsure what to say. The girl clutched at her sleeve, watching the man with awe. Still, he said nothing. It was as if he were trying to place something, not within the room, but within himself. Then the quiet was broken. A heavy boot struck the porch outside. One of the soldiers leaned into the doorway, his gloved hand braced against the frame. "Your Highness," the soldier said, low but firm. "A second detail has been dispatched from the capital. The Duke is expecting your immediate return." The room froze. Anneliese felt Lotte's fingers tighten on her arm. Her breath caught, though she did not turn toward the soldier. She looked only at him. His expression did not change, though something in his shoulders grew taut. He neither nodded nor moved. He stood still, the firelight catching the bruise near his jaw, the edge of his ring, one she hadn't noticed before, gleaming faintly beneath his glove. He looked at her then. Truly looked, as he had by the river, though his eyes were clearer now, sharper, the green of them steady and deliberate. "What is your name?" he asked. For a moment, Anneliese couldn't speak. The question hung in the air, impossibly simple and unbearably weighted. Her name, something so ordinary, so woven into the daily rhythms of life, now felt like a confession. She swallowed. Her voice, when it came, was soft but steady. "Anneliese Mertens." The name hovered for a beat, caught between the hearth and the open door, suspended like the snowflakes still drifting across the threshold. The man repeated it, Mertens, quietly, as though trying the shape of it on his tongue, not with mockery or disbelief, but with a quiet intent that made her stomach twist. Then he nodded, a single movement that gave nothing away. No surprise, no revelation. His expression remained unreadable, his features calm, composed, but the glance he cast over her face lingered just a moment too long. Outside, the soldiers shifted. One of them cleared his throat, pointedly. The man, no, the prince, though he had never said as much, turned at last. He took a single step back toward the door, the soles of his boots brushing softly against the threshold of packed earth and stone. The cold wind curled around him again as if claiming him back. Still, he said nothing. No farewell, no explanation, no reason for his presence at her door, or for the look in his eyes that she could not quite forget. He only turned, the heavy folds of his coat swaying, and walked out into the waiting hush of snow. The soldiers fell in around him with practiced ease. None looked back. Within seconds, the rhythm of hooves resumed, muffled by the snow-covered road as the small procession disappeared between the trees. The only trace left behind was a faint indentation in the earth and the lingering scent of cold leather and wood smoke. Anneliese closed the door with trembling hands. Her grandmother had stirred again but didn't speak. Lotte had slipped behind the curtain, her small body bundled in silence. The fire crackled in the hearth, but its warmth didn't reach her. Anneliese stood there motionless, the bundle still in her arms. She hadn't lied. That was her name. And yet giving it to him had felt like giving away a part of herself she hadn't meant to. A piece he had now taken with him into the snow. The next morning dawned with a gray sky and brittle air. The storm had passed, leaving the village quiet and white. Smoke drifted lazily from rooftops. Boots pressed narrow paths into the snow along the central lane. Life resumed, though not unchanged. By midday, whispers had begun to stir. A merchant's son arrived early from the road leading east, breathless and flushed, with tales carried from the far edges of the forest. An ambush, he said, an attempted assassination. The heir to the Grand Duchy had been attacked during his return from the southern provinces. His escort scattered, his carriage overturned. For 2 days, he'd been missing, but now he'd returned, alive. Word spread like fire across the snow-laden rooftops. Prince Alaric von Falkenberg, that was his name, and he had survived by unknown means. The capital buzzed with it. Nobles speculated on who had betrayed him. Some blamed radicals. Others murmured of court intrigue, old alliances broken, or perhaps challenged by marriage negotiations no one yet understood. By the second day, even the farmers at the mill had heard the name. Anneliese said nothing. She continued as she always had, fetching water, tending to her grandmother's cough, preparing soup from thin broth and withered potatoes. But the rhythm of her thoughts was no longer quiet. She saw his face in the glow of the hearth. She heard his voice. "What is your name?" Each syllable crisp in her memory. At night, her hand would brush the wool of her blanket, freshly laundered, the scent of foreign soap still faint in the weave. Her fingers lingered on its edge. She told herself it meant nothing, but her sleep had changed. It came slowly, and when it did, it was restless. Dreams hovered just out of reach. Dreams of footsteps in the snow, of a voice saying her name over and over. By the 4th day, the village had returned to its routines. The market was reopened, its stalls draped with burlap to keep out the cold. The well had frozen in the early morning, and the men took turns breaking the ice, their axes clanging against the stone rim. Anneliese waited in line with her pail, her shawl pulled tight over her shoulders, eyes lowered against the glare of snow. The line moved slowly. Her thoughts drifted, unmoored. When her turn came, she leaned forward, hooked the wooden handle, and dipped her pail deep into the cold water. The icy metal stung her fingers, but she hardly felt it. Then she heard it, the faint crunch of snow behind her. A single horse, unhurried, not a team, not a guard or a patrol. The rhythm was measured, deliberate. She turned. He was there, alone. The same dark stallion from before stood beside him, reins looped lazily around his wrist. He was cloaked in gray this time, lined with black fur, the hood pushed back to reveal his face. His jaw was still bruised, though the color had faded to a pale yellow. His eyes, however, had not faded at all. He was watching her, not in surprise, as if he had been watching her for some time. The wind had quieted since morning, though the air still clung to winter's chill. Anneliese stood at the edge of the well, her hands raw from the icy rope, her pail now full and heavy at her feet. Her shawl had slipped back slightly, and she reached to pull it forward again, then froze, her fingers tangled in the wool. He was there. Leaning against the saddle of a tall black stallion, the reins looped casually over one gloved hand, his shoulders relaxed, as if he had been waiting not for minutes but for hours. He wore no visible crest, no uniform marked him. His cloak was a muted gray, lined with fur at the collar, the fabric thick enough to shield against the cold, but simple enough not to draw attention. To anyone else, he would have passed for a traveler, a quiet man on business, weary from the road. But Anneliese knew better. Her breath caught before she could stop it. The line at the well moved behind her, the clink of pails against stone, the murmur of voices. No one else seemed to notice him. No one glanced up. He was just far enough away from the well to be unseen unless one turned deliberately. He didn't speak, only watched her with the same unnerving intensity as before, his expression unreadable. She straightened slowly, brushed the snow from her skirts, and lifted the pail by the handle. The water sloshed against the rim, and she held it steady, forcing her legs to move as she stepped away from the others and toward the shadowed grove just beyond the footpath. When she reached him, he inclined his head, not quite a nod. "Come," he said quietly. "Just a moment, away from listening ears." His voice was low, edged with caution. She hesitated, glancing once behind her at the well, then turned and followed him. They walked side by side into the trees, the stallion following without a tether, its steps soft on the snow-packed ground. Bare branches arched overhead, creaking faintly in the breeze. The scent of pine and smoke lingered on the air, and the hush around them thickened as the village fell out of sight. Annalisa glanced at him from the corner of her eye. His face bore the same bruising, though fainter now, fading into the pale skin of his jaw. His cloak shifted as he walked, revealing fine riding boots and a tailored coat beneath, still elegant, despite the absence of any royal insignia. He stopped near a clearing where the snow had flattened beneath a fallen branch and turned to face her. "I know I shouldn't have come like this," he said, "but I needed to speak with you without the eyes of others." She didn't answer, not yet. Her hands tightened on the pail's handle. "I owe you more than gratitude," he said, "and I mean to repay that debt." She opened her mouth, but he lifted one hand lightly. "Not with coins, not with titles or favors," he said. "I came to offer something more enduring." The pause that followed was filled with the quiet rustle of wind against snow. His gaze searched hers, more reserved now, but no less direct. "There's a place in my aunt's household," he continued, "the Dowager Duchess. She has requested a new attendant, someone outside the circle of court politics, someone unspoiled by that world." Annalisa's brow knit. "You'd live within her household, in the capital. As her servant, you would be safe. Under her protection, and mine." The words landed slowly, like snow accumulating on a roof. A place in the court, servant, duchess, capital. He said it calmly, carefully, measured like a contract. But there was something in the way he said it that trembled beneath the surface of control. His jaw was tense. His eyes didn't leave hers. He wasn't only offering her employment. He was asking her to stay within reach. She swallowed, her heart thudding hard in her chest. Her hands were trembling slightly, though from the cold or from something else she couldn't say. The air between them felt suspended, as if one wrong movement might shatter it. "She's not an ordinary woman," he said after a moment. "She raised me when I was a boy, taught me what it meant to speak and be heard, to observe, to think." Annalise had heard whispers of the Duchess before. The villagers spoke of her with a kind of wary respect. They said she had once refused marriage for the sake of her independence, that she spoke her mind at council, even before the Duke himself, and that, though noble by birth, she had no patience for fools. Still, the capital was a world apart from Badenweiler. The court was not merely grand, it was dangerous. A misplaced glance, a wrong word, a threadbare dress. Any of these things could ruin a girl like her. He must have seen the flicker of fear in her eyes, because he stepped closer. "No one will harm you," he said, his voice firmer now. "Not while you're under her care, or mine." The silence stretched again. The trees stood still. Somewhere in the distance, a crow cawed once, then fell silent. Annalise looked down at her hands. The handle of the pail bit into her skin. She thought of her grandmother's cough, of Lotta's too thin arms, of the cracked windows in their cottage, the way the floor groaned underfoot, of years spent in quiet sacrifice. And then she thought of the court, of gowns and chandeliers and whispered cruelty, of power, of the cold splendor of that world. She looked up again and met his gaze. "Why me?" she asked. He didn't answer at first. His breath was visible in the cold, slow and steady. Finally, he said, "Because you saw me when no one else would have." Because you gave warmth without asking who I was. It wasn't an answer in the way she expected, but it was true, and that truth moved through her like a tremor. Still, her voice was quiet when she said, "I'll have to ask my grandmother." He gave a single nod, almost a bow. Of course. They walked back in silence. At home, her grandmother listened from her chair beside the hearth, her eyes sharp despite the fatigue carved into her face. She said little as Annalisa explained, only nodded once, slowly, as if the words were not new but simply late in arriving. "You've always had a good instinct, child," the old woman said, her voice rough. "Trust it now." Then she added, almost to herself, "Fate rides in strange saddles." That night, Annalisa packed only what she could carry: a second shift, a comb, a worn shawl. Her blanket, the one returned to her, still soft from the hands that had held it. She barely slept. Her thoughts drifted and twisted, filled with uncertainty and the echo of a green-eyed gaze. When the sky was still dark, she stepped outside. The air was brittle and sharp, the snow faintly crusted with ice. The carriage waited at the bend in the road, its wheels muffled by straw and canvas drawn tightly over the sides. No crest, no gold. She walked toward it, heart hammering. She didn't know what she expected. Perhaps to see him there, waiting at the door, ready to offer a hand, ready to speak again in that low, steady voice. But when she opened the curtain and stepped inside, the first person she saw was a young woman in deep emerald velvet, her dark hair coiled like a crown, and her eyes gleaming with calculation beneath a too smooth smile. The interior of the carriage was warmer than Annalisa expected, padded with dark velvet and smelling faintly of rosewater and leather. But it was the woman seated across from her who captured all the light in the small space. She was young, not much older than Annalisa, but her presence filled the carriage as though she had occupied it all her life. Her gown, a deep, resplendent green, shimmered with every small movement, its embroidery catching the gray morning light that slipped through the curtained windows. Her hair was dark, styled in sleek coils that sat like a crown atop her head, not a strand out of place. Her posture was perfect, her hands gloved in ivory kid leather, folded gracefully over her lap. And she was smiling. It was the kind of smile that asked for nothing and promised less, a smile honed sharp as glass. Annalisa blinked, hesitating at the threshold, her travel bag still clutched to her chest. The curtain fell shut behind her, the outside world muffled instantly. The air thickened. "You must be the girl," the woman said, her voice smooth, precise, as if her words had been hand-stitched by a seamstress. Annalisa found her voice with effort. "Yes, I was told there would be a carriage." The woman inclined her head as though granting her permission to speak further. "Baroness Ilse von Reichenau," she said, her smile unchanging, "of the Rhineland House. My family owns vineyards along the Moselle. You've heard of them, perhaps." Annalisa's mouth went dry. She shook her head once. Ilse tilted her head, studying her more closely. "No matter. You'll have time to learn." Her gaze dropped to Annalisa's hands. "You're trembling." Annalisa tightened her grip on the satchel instinctively. "I imagine the journey must be quite overwhelming," Ilse said. Her tone feigned sympathy, though the smile didn't touch her eyes. "After all, most girls don't leave their village until they marry, or until the fields go dry." Annalisa sat cautiously, unsure whether to respond. The seat was cushioned, but her body remained tense, poised at the edge. Ilse's eyes flicked to her clothes. Wool. Hand-dyed, I assume.
"Homespun?" "Yes," Annalisa said quietly. "It's charming," Ilse replied. And though the word should have sounded kind, it didn't. There's something to be said for humble beginnings. You'll find the court full of those who love such stories, so long as they end with proper obedience. Annalisa stared down at her lap, unsure where to look. Her fingers curled tighter around the satchel. Don't mistake me, Ilsa went on, smoothing her glove with a slow, deliberate motion.
I admire those who make the most of modest circumstances. The Duchess's household, while rigid in its expectations, is gracious to those who learn quickly. But the court, her voice lowered slightly, the court is not so kind. Annalisa lifted her eyes. Girls who arrive with dreams and sentiment tend to last only a season or two, Ilsa said, especially if they forget their place. There it was, the warning beneath the velvet. I've come to serve, Annalisa said. Ilsa gave a soft, amused sound. Have you? She leaned back slightly, gaze narrowing in something like thought. The Duchess is known for making unusual choices. Perhaps she saw something promising. We shall see. The carriage rocked as the wheels turned over frozen ground. Outside, trees blurred past in grey-green smudges. Inside, the air remained close, perfumed with something floral and too sweet. Annalisa kept her eyes forward, the silence between them stretching like glass. She did not speak again, and neither did Ilsa. Hours later, the silhouette of the capital rose into view, its spires piercing the clouds, its rooftops dusted with fresh snow. The carriage passed through iron gates, flanked by guards in winter livery, and wound through the outer court toward the stone facade of the Duchess's residence. It was smaller than the main palace, though still imposing, with windows like watchful eyes and chimneys like sentinels. Annalisa braced herself. The footman opened the door and helped her down. The moment her boots met the marble of the courtyard, the weight of her decision sank fully into her chest. She turned, but Ilsa was already descending on her own, her cloak unfurling like a banner as she swept ahead without waiting. Annalise was led not to the servant quarters as she had expected, but through a quieter wing of the residence, where the carpets muffled every footstep and the air was faint with lavender and old parchment. She passed panelled doors and muted tapestries, unsure whether to look at anything too long. When the maid guiding her opened a chamber near the Duchess's apartments, Annalisa stared in disbelief. The room was small, yes, but private. A bed, not a pallet. A window with actual glass. A basin, a small chest. A chair carved with delicate floral etchings. Modest by noble standards, but more than anything she had ever imagined. Sit here, the maid said. The Duchess will see you shortly. She left before Annalisa could respond. A few minutes later, the door opened again. The Dowager Duchess entered without preamble, her presence like a blade wrapped in silk. She wore a gown of dark plum, fitted with perfect precision. Her silver hair was coiled into an elegant knot, held by a single jeweled comb. Her eyes were pale gray, sharp, knowing, and utterly without illusion. She studied Annalisa in silence. Annalisa stood slowly, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "You're the girl," the Duchess said. Her voice was low and firm, like the final stroke of a gavel. "Yes, Your Grace." "I'm not interested in false modesty," the Duchess said, "nor in gratitude. You've been brought here for reasons that have nothing to do with charity." Annalisa's breath caught, but she didn't speak. "I've accepted you into my household," the Duchess continued. "You'll serve as a companion, not a maid. That means you'll be seen, heard, watched. I expect dignity and restraint. Speak only when spoken to. Watch everything." Annalisa nodded, her heart pounding. The Duchess turned slightly, one hand resting on the doorframe. Then she added, without looking back, "He'll want you where he can see you." The door closed behind her. The words echoed long after she'd gone. The next 2 days passed in a haze of adjustment. Annalisa was given tasks, fetching parchment, arranging the Duchess's quills, preparing correspondence. She moved carefully, observed everything, kept her answers brief. She was spoken to seldom, and never by the other companions, whose polite smiles rarely touched their eyes. The servants, once curious, now avoided her gaze. Whispers followed her like shadows. Rumors began to stir, quiet and sharp. Her presence in the Duchess's wing, unexplained, unsponsored, was enough to mark her as strange. And always she felt eyes on her, sometimes from the far end of the corridor, sometimes across the corridor's mirrored glass. Ilse. She never spoke again to Annalisa directly, but she passed often, always alone, always poised. Her expressions were unreadable, her silences louder than any insult. Annalisa bore it in silence. She was not meant to belong here, and everyone knew it. On the third evening, just after supper, Annalisa was handed a sealed letter to deliver to the Duchess's antechamber. The hallway was dim, lit by a row of wall sconces. She walked softly, fingers curled around the parchment. She opened the wrong door. The light inside was low, one lamp on the desk, a single candle flickering beside it. Prince Alaric sat alone, his head bowed slightly, his shoulders tense. He hadn't heard the door. The fire in the hearth cast a golden glow along the edge of his profile. His hand rested on a sheet of vellum, a marriage contract. The wax seal glinted red. Her eyes caught the names: Alaric von Falkenberg, Ilse von Reichenau. He hadn't noticed her yet. Annalisa's breath caught as the candle wavered. The door creaked softly beneath her fingers. Annalisa closed the door with a care that felt unnatural, her hand trembling against the cold brass handle. The faint click of the latch seemed far too loud in the silence of the corridor. For a moment, she stood there in the dusky half-light, her breath caught, her chest hollowed by what she had seen. The names had been unmistakable. Prince Alaric von Falkenberg, Baroness Ilse von Reichenau. She had read them once, but they lingered in her mind with the permanence of a brand. Sealed in red wax, precise and elegant, the contract bore the mark of inevitability. It hadn't been a draft. It had been final. She walked quickly, the parchment in her hand forgotten, her steps too fast for someone meant to be invisible. She didn't stop until she reached the narrow staircase that led to the lesser hallway, her fingers tightening on the railing as the chill of the stone seemed to seep through her shoes. The court had always been a puzzle, but now it felt like a trap, each corridor a narrowing path. The rules were no longer veiled. They pressed around her like the whalebone of a corset, tightening, closing. She had entered this world through a doorway opened by kindness. She had not expected that the warmth of one night beneath a bridge could become so entangled in the politics of a dynasty. And yet, there he was, signing away his future to another. She returned the letter she had been carrying to the antechamber as instructed, careful this time to knock twice before entering. The Duchess was not there, and the room remained quiet, dim, the candlelight flickering faintly across parchment and velvet furnishings. Back in her chamber, Annalisa sat on the edge of the bed and tried to quiet her thoughts. She touched the edge of the blanket folded at the foot, her old one, laundered and clean but still hers, and felt her throat tighten. She told herself it had never meant more than what it was: repayment, a gesture of politeness, gratitude. But politeness did not explain the way he had looked at her, or spoken to her. Still, the contract was real. She kept to herself the next day, completing her tasks with quiet efficiency. The Duchess said nothing, but her glance was sharp, perceptive. Annalisa sensed she had been seen even in silence. And Prince Alaric? He passed her in the corridor, flanked by two councilmen, his expression calm, unreadable. His eyes flicked to hers, just for a moment, and moved on. He did not pause. He did not speak. But the flicker of recognition in his gaze was there, brief and tightly guarded. It unsettled her more than if he had ignored her altogether. He became a constant shadow, always near, but never present. He spoke with formality when their paths crossed. A slight nod, a few clipped words, no more. The warmth that had once lived in his gaze had been buried beneath layers of courtly restraint. And yet, she saw the signs when no one else looked. The way his hands curled slightly at his sides when Ilse approached him too closely. the stiffness in his posture when her laughter trailed down the corridor, the pause in his step when he heard Annalise's voice, even if he never turned to see her. She learned to watch, not just him, but everyone. The Duchess had not given her further instructions, but her movements were not without purpose. Annalise noticed who lingered outside doors and who whispered too softly behind fans. The Duchess's older cousin, Lady Erin, took a quiet liking to her, and during one afternoon walk through the frozen gardens, spoke without pretense. "Power rarely moves in a straight line," the lady murmured, her voice thin and wry. "Those who reach for it directly often lose it altogether." Annalise listened, uncertain what response was expected. "Love," Lady Erin added, "is the most dangerous ambition of all." That night, Annalise thought of those words as she washed the ink from her fingers and folded the Duchess's letters into neat stacks. Love had never been her ambition, and yet it had taken hold of her heart before she'd known it had begun. 2 nights later, just before the bell tolled for evening rest, she was sent back to the Duchess's study to collect a letter that had been left behind. The corridors were quiet, dimly lit. She moved quickly, familiar now with the way shadows played across the tapestry-lined walls. The study was empty, but a soft murmur of voices reached her from the far end, just beyond the partition screen near the hearth. She froze in place. A man's voice, calm, tightly restrained. A woman's, colder, sharp with precision. Annalise knew them both. She didn't mean to listen. She only meant to wait, to retrieve the letter once they were gone. But the words struck clearly, even through the thin screen. "You've delayed long enough," Ilsa said. "The council has done its part. The contracts are ready. Your silence insults more than just me." Alaric's response was low, almost inaudible. "You think this is a game?" Ilsa hissed. "Do you believe yourself above the alliance our families have built over generations? Do you think your father will allow sentiment to interfere with what must be done?" A pause. Annalise's heart pounded. Then Alaric spoke, quiet but steady. "You mistake my reluctance for sentiment," he said. "It is duty I question." Ilsa's voice rose in fury. "You dare—" But the rest was lost in the sudden scrape of Annalise's shoe against the rug. The edge of the tapestry caught beneath her boot, sending a brass tray sliding from the side table. It clattered to the floor, a noise sharp as a bell. The voices beyond the screen went silent. Annalise's breath caught in her throat. She crouched quickly, reaching for the tray, her fingers trembling. Her knees pressed into the carpet, but her body froze at the sound. Soft, measured footsteps approaching the screen. Annalise's knees still ached from the rug, the edge of the brass tray cold beneath her fingers. She didn't breathe. Her eyes stayed fixed on the floor as footsteps approached the screen, measured, slow, deliberate. Then, just before the figure rounded the corner, another set of softer steps intervened. A servant. He spotted her crouched behind the screen and froze, eyes widening. His mouth opened in disbelief. Then he gave the smallest shake of his head. He leaned close enough for her to see the panic in his eyes, and whispered one word. "Leave. Now." She didn't wait for clarification. The tray still clutched in her hands. She rose without looking toward the prince or the baroness, slipped past the servant, and darted from the study into the corridor. Her breath came in shallow gasps, but she forced herself to keep walking, never running, never looking back. Her pulse roared in her ears. She felt Ilsa's fury before it was ever voiced. Back in her chamber, the door shut with a soft thud. She sank to the edge of the bed, heart pounding so hard it echoed in her limbs. The tray had left a red imprint against her palms. The room was quiet, lit only by a small oil lamp. But the air felt tighter, sharper, as though something invisible now shared the space. Ilsa would not let this pass. That was certain. Whatever Annalise had overheard, whatever small piece of power she now unknowingly held, would be punished. And yet she had not heard the prince rise, nor seen him come after her. That somehow unsettled her more than if he had. Morning arrived behind a sky of ashen gray. Snow dusted the windowsills. The chill had settled deeper, creeping into the stone floors and iron hinges. She rose early, combed her hair, folded her blanket, and dressed as plainly as she could manage. There would be consequences. She was prepared. When the summons came, it did not come from a god. A page delivered it on parchment, embossed at the corner with the Duchess's personal seal. The message was short, impersonal. She was to report to the salon. Annalisa walked the corridors with quiet steps, her hands clasped together beneath her sleeves. She passed two servants who avoided her eyes. At the door to the salon, the guard opened it without question. Inside, the Duchess stood at a table draped in ivory linen, her fingers sorting through papers and cuttings of fabric. The light from the tall windows caught the silver streaks in her hair and made them shimmer like steel. "Close the door," the Duchess said without looking up. Annalisa obeyed. "I assume," the Duchess continued, her tone dry and clear, "you're wondering whether this is a reprimand." Annalisa hesitated, then nodded once. "Yes, Your Grace." The Duchess turned, her pale eyes sharp. "You've been moved, not as punishment, as necessity." Annalisa didn't speak. "We have a reception," the Duchess said. "Ambassadors, dignitaries, nobles from half the duchy and beyond. You'll assist." She stepped closer to the table and laid down a page of names. "You'll be handling correspondence, reviewing seating plans, overseeing flower arrangements, and transcribing the guest list for the archives. You'll work closely with my steward." Annalisa's voice barely found breath. "Yes, Your Grace." The Duchess gave her one final look, as though measuring something not in her expression but in her core. "You are being moved nearer to the fire," she said. "Try not to burn." The court changed its rhythm in preparation for the reception. The air buzzed with speculation. Gowns were fitted, walls scrubbed, menus revised daily. The kitchens smelled of roasted meats and warm wine. Footmen whispered about which families had been seated closest to the prince. And always, beneath it all, the question, when would the engagement be formally announced? Annalisa moved among it all like a thread in a larger weave, pulled in quiet tension through every pattern. She was no longer at the edge of things. The Duchess's hand had drawn her closer, to influence, to scrutiny, and to him. She translated invitations from French and Low German, arranged the bouquet order for the banquet hall, and transcribed the guests' names in a script so fine it drew praise from the archivist. She barely saw Ilse in those days, but when she did, the Baroness did not speak. Her smiles were rarer now. Her silence was heavy. Alaric was everywhere. He moved with the detachment expected of a prince, but she saw the slivers of wear behind his eyes. At council meetings, in the gardens, where he spoke to foreign envoys. At the edges of the receiving hall, where he observed without seeming to. Always surrounded, always watched. And when they passed in corridors or crossed briefly in conversation, their words remained formal, measured. But his eyes betrayed him. Each glance lingered. Each silence throbbed with everything unsaid. The evening of the reception arrived like the long-awaited turn of a key. The estate was lit with hundreds of candles. Gilded mirrors reflected soft golden light. Servants moved with practiced ease, their uniforms crisp and spotless. The scent of wax and polished wood filled the air. Annalisa was stationed at the long table near the entrance to the great hall. A list of names before her, quill poised. She recorded arrivals as the steward announced them. The room filled quickly. Noble women in silks and brocades glided past her, their laughter like wind chimes. Gentlemen bowed with smooth precision. The air shimmered with perfume and whispered ambition. And then he entered. Prince Alaric. His coat was charcoal trimmed in silver, his cravat a deep wine red. On his arm, the Baroness, her gown a vivid emerald that clung to every line of her figure, a matching jewel at her throat. The room paused. They were the picture of a union, elegance, power, and legacy. Annalise's hand trembled slightly as she dipped the quill into the inkwell. They passed her without a word. She kept her eyes down. But later, as she knelt to retrieve a fallen paper beneath the table, she felt it. The briefest brush of fingertips across hers. She looked up. He was beside her, reaching for nothing, his hand retreating, his expression unchanged. The touch had lasted only a moment. It might have been accidental, but her skin burned where his fingers had touched hers. She looked after him as he returned to Ilse's side. The Baroness leaned in, speaking close to his ear, though he did not react. And then, as she passed Annalise once more, this time with deliberate slowness, she did not smile. That night, long after the last guest had gone, and the candle wax had cooled on the marble floors, Annalise returned to her chamber. Her feet ached. Her shoulders were tight. Her head throbbed with fatigue and questions. She reached for the doorknob. A slip of paper lay beneath it. She bent, heart catching. It was folded, sealed in red wax. No crest, no signature. She broke the seal with careful fingers. Inside, one sentence had been hastily scrawled. "You must leave the capital by dawn." The letter was not signed. There was no name, no seal she could trace, only the coarse red wax and the tight, slanted script written in haste. She read it once, then again. Her eyes stung. "You must leave the capital by dawn." The parchment trembled in her hand as she sat motionless on the edge of her narrow bed, the candle beside her flickering against the draught creeping in through the window panes. The words etched themselves into her skin, into her breath, until she felt as though she carried them beneath her ribcage. A warning, or a threat, or both. She stared at the wax. Red. No crest. Not royal, but meant to seem so. Ilse. Annalise had no proof, only instinct, sharpened by weeks of being watched, weighed, measured. The Baroness had said no word aloud, but her silence had changed shape. Her presence now felt like a hand pressing against a bruise. And the timing, so soon after the reception, after the touch under the table, the glance that had lasted too long, felt deliberate. Her breath came shallow. Her hands shook, though not from cold. There was no name, no consequence spelled out, just the command. Leave. By dawn. She did not sleep. When the first light of morning stretched weakly across the courtyard, she dressed in silence and carried the letter in her palm to the Duchess's private chamber. The guards at the door did not stop her. They had begun, she suspected, to expect her. The Duchess was alone, seated by the hearth, a long robe of charcoal gray wrapped around her like armor. Her silver hair was pinned high, though one wisp curled against her temple. She looked up as Annalise entered, but said nothing. Annalise approached the fire, the letter outstretched in both hands. "I found it under my door last night." The Duchess took it without comment. Her fingers did not tremble. She read the message once, slowly, as if the handwriting itself might yield some hidden meaning. Then she rose, stepped toward the hearth, and fed the parchment into the flames. The fire snapped, the wax hissed, and the words were gone. "You came to me rather than obeying it," the Duchess said calmly. "That's a beginning." Annalise said nothing. The Duchess turned to face her. Leaving now would be surrender, and surrender is unbecoming of anyone under my roof. She did not speak as a woman soothing a frightened girl. She spoke as someone issuing orders on the battlefield. Annalise nodded, but the knot in her stomach did not ease. The danger hadn't vanished with the burning of the letter. It simply slipped out of sight. The days that followed turned heavy with silence. She walked the corridors more cautiously now, her eyes catching every unfamiliar face, every glance that lingered too long. Conversations in her presence ended swiftly. Servants who once greeted her with warmth now lowered their gazes and passed by in quiet. There was no confrontation, no open cruelty, only a thickening quiet, like a room where the air had gone still before a storm. She completed her tasks without complaint. The Duchess gave her no indication of concern, only the same calm, measured expectations. But every moment now felt borrowed, and still, no word from Alaric. She saw him often, at a distance, behind council doors, in the library speaking to his advisors. Always proper, always guarded. The reception had left its mark. Whispers of his future marriage echoed through every chamber. The name of Baroness Ilsa curled like smoke in the mouths of courtiers. And yet, he said nothing. Until one late afternoon, when she was sent to the south wing to review the inventories for the winter feast. She was alone in the conservatory, checking the quantities of preserved fruits, when the door opened behind her, and he stepped inside. He did not call her name. He did not bow. He simply closed the door and stood for a long moment in the silence, his eyes meeting hers, with a weight that turned her breath shallow. "You've had no peace since that night," he said quietly. She swallowed. "It's not important." "It is." He stepped closer, his voice low, stripped of formality. "That contract was placed in my hands without my consent. I stalled it for months, delayed it, refused to sign." Annalise's fingers tightened on the list she held. "They finally forced it forward," he continued. "Political necessity, old debts, alliances built long before I was born. I don't expect pity for it." He paused, his gaze shifting slightly. "But I came back to the bridge because I could not forget how you looked at me. When I had no name, no status. You didn't ask for anything. You didn't flinch." She didn't speak. Her heart pounded, too loud in her chest. "I am heir to a legacy carved by other men's hands," he said. "But I have made very few choices that were truly mine. And you—" He stopped himself as if saying more would breach something he could not rebuild. He stepped closer. "I don't ask for forgiveness or promises. But you deserve to know the truth." She looked up at him then, her eyes wide and uncertain. She saw the war in him, between duty and longing, between the man who had stood beneath the bridge and the one whose name was etched into treaties. Before she could speak, the bell in the chapel courtyard began to toll, once, twice, 3 times. A summons. The Duchess's household was called together. Footmen and ladies-in-waiting gathered beneath the archways. The sound echoed against the stone, pulling everyone from their tasks. Outside, beneath the high eaves of the chapel, the Duke's steward stepped forward with a scroll. His voice was clear, solemn, echoing through the courtyard. "By decree of His Grace, the Duke of Falkenberg, and with approval of the Council, the betrothal of His Highness Prince Alaric to Baroness Ilsa von Reichenau is hereby announced. The marriage contract has been finalized. The wedding shall take place on the first day of spring." A ripple moved through the crowd. Applause followed, measured, polite, hollow. Annalise stood still at the edge of the gathering, her shoulders squared. She did not clap. She did not move. The sound of it closed around her like a sealed door. She turned to leave, slipping quietly through the edge of the crowd, her head lowered. And then she felt it. A gaze, unblinking. She lifted her eyes once, slowly. Alaric was watching her, not Ilsa. Not the steward. Her. His expression did not shift. His face was still. But in that moment, it was as though the entire world had gone silent around him. The days after the chapel announcement passed with the strange weight of unreleased breath. The court adjusted with practiced ease, as it always did. Staff spoke of the wedding as if it had already passed into history. The florists began drafting designs for spring. The kitchens shifted their stores to include the imported wines favored by the Reichenau family. And the musicians began rehearsals in the courtyard, their melodies drifting faint and distant through the stone halls, like the sound of memory. Annalise resumed her work, but the rhythm of it had changed. Her presence at court became more formal, more peripheral, as though the current that had once pulled her closer now receded. No one was unkind. No harsh words were spoken. But the eyes that once greeted her now slid past. Her name disappeared from duty rosters and was replaced by others in tight, elegant script. The Duchess, once sharp and exacting in her daily observations, spoke less frequently. Her voice remained cool and authoritative, but her silences deepened. Annalisa still performed the tasks she was given, but her steps grew slower, her evenings quieter. When she passed the long windows of the great hall, she saw her own reflection looking more like a visitor than a companion. She wrote to her grandmother, carefully, slowly, choosing each word like a stone she was laying into place. She asked that the cottage hearth be prepared, that Lotta be kept near in the evenings. She promised she would return soon. She did not write of the prince. She did not write of the Baroness. She signed the letter with affection, but no elaboration. Folded it, sealed it, sent it. In her chamber she began to gather what she had brought. Not much. A shawl, the small comb with the missing tooth, a bit of lace she had been gifted by one of the maids early in her stay, before whispers had hardened into wariness. The blanket he had returned to her, the only object she lingered on, the one she folded last and held longest. She told herself that what passed between them had been real, that it was never promised, never named, but no less real for its silence. That perhaps it was enough. She did not cry. And Alaric? He became a shadow of himself. He attended council meetings. He gave his assent at court functions, but he no longer walked in the gardens. He no longer dined in the formal hall. He made no public appearances with Ilse. When she passed him, which she did often now without a word, his posture remained upright, his steps measured. But his eyes were distant, locked inward, as though searching for something he had misplaced. The whispers grew louder. The wedding, they said, was being delayed. No formal procession had been planned. The Baroness had begun to press the Duke's council with demands for clarity, for formalities, for the honor that was her due. The longer she waited, the sharper her tone became. But the Duke gave no public statement, and the Prince said nothing. The Duchess, as ever, observed without interference. Her gaze swept over the court with the cold patience of a woman who had seen entire reigns rise and wither. She offered no endorsement, no rebuke. She allowed the quiet storm to build without throwing open a single shutter. And then, late one evening, Annalise was called to her chamber. The room was lit by only one candle. The Duchess stood beside the hearth, her arms crossed, her head tilted in the way that suggested she had already measured every possible outcome and was only waiting for others to catch up. "Sit," she said, gesturing to the chair opposite. Annalisa obeyed. The Duchess studied her with the stillness of a hawk, her voice low and without prelude. "Do you love him?" Annalisa blinked, the question striking with the force of a blade rather than a whisper. Her mouth parted, but the truth was already there, rising like breath. "Yes." The Duchess nodded once, slowly. "Then decide. Will you fight for him? Or will you flee?" There was no tenderness in the question, no counsel, only a mirror held up to her heart. Annalisa said nothing, but she did not lower her gaze. That night, she did not sleep. She sat at the edge of the bed with her hands folded in her lap, the window open a crack to the winter air. Outside, the snow began to fall again, soft and slow, drifting down like ash from an unseen fire. The candles had burned low by the time she heard the footfall in the hall. Not the hurried steps of a messenger, not the measured tread of a guard, just one man's steps. She stood, heart still and strange, and opened the chamber door. The maid stood there. No message in hand, only a quiet instruction. "He's in the salon." Annalise's feet carried her before she could think, before her heart could catch up. The corridor was empty, the sconces burned low. She passed no one. When she reached the salon, the doors were already ajar. He was there. Prince Alaric stood alone in the center of the room, snow dusting his shoulders, his hat in one hand. He wore no crest, no sash, no ceremonial brooch, only a long dark coat and gloves he had not removed. He had come without escort, without permission, without formality. He did not bow. He did not speak. He simply looked at her, and the breath between them vanished. Annalisa stepped into the room, the doors closing gently behind her. Her hands were steady. Her pulse no longer raced. He took one step toward her, then another. She took one step forward, and then another. There was no fear. There was no hesitation. There was only the quiet truth between them, unspoken for too long hidden beneath duty and silence, and now rising with the certainty of a tide that would not be turned back. They had waited long enough. The snow melted slowly that year, as if reluctant to surrender its claim on the capital. But as the days lengthened, the ice began to crack at the edges of fountains and garden walls, and the sun returned with tentative fingers of warmth. The streets, once slick with frost, shimmered now with the wet gleam of thaw. Shoots of green pressed up through the soil in the Duchess's garden, trembling in the breeze like promises waiting to bloom. In the days following Alaric's unannounced visit to the salon, change moved through the estate with quiet, methodical grace. Not the violence of upheaval, but the precision of a needle stitching an entirely new pattern into a well-worn tapestry. The Duchess, ever composed, began her work. There were no outbursts, no accusations. She did not summon the council or storm the Duke's offices. Instead, she dispatched 2 clerks from her household to retrieve the original copies of the marriage contract, citing a need to transcribe and archive the agreement for the court's historical records. 3 days later, the irregularities were discovered. The Baroness's lands, it was revealed, had been incorrectly listed in the property annex. An oversight, some said, a clerical error. But another clause, buried in the stipulations of the dowry, contradicted a more recent inheritance claim. That contradiction called into question the entire foundation of the union. To press forward would invite public inquiry, and inquiry would invite scandal. The Duke, who valued discretion above legacy, made his decision swiftly. The engagement was retracted. No announcement was made, no apology issued. Only a quiet correction to the court registry, and a new title granted to the Baroness, Countess of Badenburg, an obscure coastal holding far to the north. A gracious offering to save face, and a dismissal wrapped in velvet. Ilse left the capital within the week. She did not speak to Alaric before she went, nor did she speak to the Duchess, or anyone else beyond what protocol demanded. She departed with her chin high, and her expression fixed in a fury so still it became a mask. Her carriage passed the gates without fanfare. And though her name continued to circulate among the gossips for a few weeks more, it was gradually replaced by fresher scandals, newer arrangements, and other women's jewels. The court, restless as ever, moved on. Alaric and Annalisa did not. They remained at the Duchess's estate, away from the central palace. Annalisa was given no position this time, neither companion nor maid, but was named quietly and with no ceremony as the Duchess's ward. A title without precedent, created solely for her protection. It allowed her access to the household without expectation and offered no one, highborn or otherwise, the grounds to question her presence. She no longer walked the halls in silence. Now, she and Alaric moved through the estate with unspoken ease, not as lovers parading affection, but as 2 people who had stepped beyond the reach of pretense. They met in the gardens beneath frost-laced branches. They stood together in the long corridors, speaking in hushed voices that never needed raising. There were no declarations, no vows, only glances that lingered, touches that spoke when words would not suffice. No one commented, no one dared. It was not scandal, nor was it spectacle. It was quiet, it was steady, it was earned. The Duchess never mentioned the change directly, but her instructions to the staff became fewer. Her glances toward Annalisa softened. On one occasion, when passing the 2 in the main corridor, She merely gave a slight nod and continued on, as though she had known from the beginning that this ending had always been the only one that mattered. Winter passed, and on the first morning of spring, with the sky pale and clear and the last remnants of snow retreating into the forest shade, Alaric brought Annalisa back to the old Roman bridge. The journey was short. The stallions trotted along the same path she had once walked alone, cloak clutched tight, basket in hand. But now she rode beside him, the wind in her hair, the sun touching her skin like an old friend. The trees, bare just weeks before, had begun to bud again. The underbrush glistened with meltwater. The river ran full and swift, its current dark with thawed earth, its voice louder than she remembered. As they dismounted, the sound of it wrapped around them like memory. The bridge still stood, low and weathered, moss clinging stubbornly to its stone edges. It arched over the churning water, as it always had. Time had not softened its lines. If anything, the winter had only emphasized its strength. Annalisa stood at its edge, her hands resting on the cool stone. Alaric approached from behind and removed his cloak. Without a word, he placed it gently over her shoulders. The weight of it settled warmly across her back. She smiled. "And this time," she said softly, "I'm warm enough." He didn't answer, not with words. The breeze moved gently through the trees. A single bird trilled from somewhere beyond the bend of the river. They stood side by side, the past behind them like the snow still hidden beneath the firs, the future ahead of them, unwritten. And in that stillness, without crowns or courtiers, without duty or deception, they stood not as prince and peasant, but as two souls who had found each other in a storm. Not through power, not through promise, but through a single, quiet act of kindness in the cold. Thank you so much for listening to this story all the way to the end. We hope it moved you as much as it moved us while telling it. If you enjoyed this story, I'd love to know what you thought. What was your favorite moment? Was it the first time they met under the snow? Or perhaps their final return to the bridge where it all began? Leave a comment below and share your thoughts. I truly enjoy reading each and every one of them. Your feedback means a lot and helps this story reach even more romance lovers like you. Leave us a comment telling us where you're listening from and what you like the most. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What score would you give it? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like as a show of support. That really motivates us to keep creating and sharing more stories full of emotion and life lessons. And before we go, we want to remind you that an exciting and heartwarming story recommendation will appear on the final screen. If you'd like to enjoy it, just click on the video. Thank you once again for being here, and we'll see you in the next story.